Good afternoon. My name is John Hallway. I'm the Executive Director of the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School. On behalf of my colleagues at the Quattrone Center, as well as my colleagues at Penn Law's Toll Public Interest Law Center and our Office of Inclusion and Engagement, I want to welcome each of you to this webinar on criminal justice reform and forensics, the importance of evidence. This is the most recent in our series of conversations in a year-long colloquium, Achieving Racial Justice, as Penn Law seeks to encourage civil and civic discussions about the role of police in our society and work internally and externally against anti-Black violence and racism and to promote meaningful change towards a more just reality. Our first conversation in the series, Beyond Reform, Re-envisioning the Role of Police, was a panel discussion moderated by Penn Law Sociology and Africana Studies as Professor Dorothy Roberts that explored the different definitions of the very words police reform. As Professor Roberts said, to many people it seems completely inconceivable to talk about anything beyond tweaks in the current system, let alone abolition. But the killings of, among many others, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Daniel Prude, and the recent shooting of Jacob Blake have made this a critical inflection point in American history, and our conversation looked at prospects for large-scale structural change in policing. We followed that conversation with a virtual discussion about structural frustrations, challenges to implementing change, in which we brought together Charles Ramsey, the co-chair of President Obama's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, as well as other experts on city government and civilian police oversight, to help us understand what political and legal barriers can complicate or prevent dedicated reformers from implementing changes. Both of these talks are available on video on the Quattrone Center's and Penn Law's website. In today's conversation, Criminal Justice Reform and Forensics, the importance of evidence, we'll discuss an essential but often overlooked aspect of the criminal justice system, the collection of evidence from crime scenes and the downstream implications of that act on police investigations and on criminal case prosecutions. As former NFL coach Bill Parcells once said, "If you want me to cook the dinner, you gotta let me buy the groceries." He was referring to the ability to select players for his football team, but the same might be said for the collection of evidence to be analyzed, evaluated, and interpreted by forensic laboratories. A number of scientific organizations, including the National Academy of Science and the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, have reviewed the feature comparison methods used by forensic labs around the country and expressed concerns about whether those methodologies are appropriately validated in rigorous clinical studies to allow us to understand when and how often errors might occur. But whether we're talking about DNA and toxicology analysis, fingerprint or ballistics, or areas of comparison that have less of a scientific basis for comparison, like footprints or tire tracks, the fact remains that the way we gather evidence and the preservation of that evidence is itself a discipline that can't help but affect the rest of a criminal case. In a world where increasingly we want our laboratories to be separate from the investigational role of police and focus on the objective criteria of science, where does crime scene investigation fit in? Should it be thought of as police work within the investigational role, or is it scientific work to be held within the laboratory? Does that distinction change the way it's performed? How can we be sure we're collecting evidence in a thoughtful, rigorous, disciplined, and consistent way that maximizes its utility in criminal cases? And what are the risks if we don't achieve those lofty goals? We're really excited to be here in partnership with the Houston Forensic Science Center to discuss these and other questions. I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves, but briefly, we will hear from, I'm going to do this in alphabetical order, Joseph T. Latta, who spent 30 years with the Burbank, California Police Department before becoming the Executive Director of the International Association for Property and Evidence, or IAPE, an organization that and the President of Evidence Control Systems, an organization that consults with jurisdictions in North America on evidence control rooms. Ms. Akila Mance, General Counsel of the Houston Forensic Science Center and a former Assistant District Attorney, so someone responsible for accepting the evidence collected and then analyzed by the Forensic Laboratory. Ms. Stacy Mitchell, Clinical Assistant Professor and Director of the Center of Excellence at Texas A&M's College of Nursing and Chair of the Board of Directors of the Houston Forensic Science Center. Dr. Jerry Pena, Director of Crime Scene Investigations and the Multimedia Evidence Section of the Houston Forensic Science Center, and Dr. Peter Stout, the CEO and President of the Houston Forensic Science Center. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Stout to get the ball rolling, but a little housekeeping to start. We invite members of the audience to submit questions to us by clicking on the Q&A button in the bottom of the ribbon below. We can't promise we'll be able to get to all questions in the time allotted, but we'll do our best. We'll be watching that area for your thoughts. Second, I doubt we'll have a problem with this, but please keep your questions topical and appropriate. We reserve our rights to remove anybody from the webinar who is posting inappropriate language or content. Third, you should know that we are recording this webinar. A video will be posted on our website as soon as it becomes available afterwards. And finally, for CLE, there will be 4 moments when I have to give people passcodes. The first passcode for any Philadelphia Flyers fan is GRITTY, G-R-I-T-T-Y. GRITTY is the first CLE passcode. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Stout. I'll invite the rest of our panelists to come back on video, and let's get the conversation started. Peter, take it away.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. This is a good-sized audience I see today. So it's encouraging to me to see people taking an interest in property and evidence management, because you're right. 20 years of running laboratories, what I have seen is, yeah, there are real science issues that we have to continue to pay attention to. Mixture interpretation and DNA and what star mix and probabilistic genotyping does for us, science issue. But what I see fail more often in laboratories is not actually science. It's an engineering challenge. It is getting the right sample in the right tube with the right label, with the right test, onto the right report, back to the right person a million times a year. And that's not easy, particularly when the quality of evidence that comes to laboratories is uniformly poor for a huge variety of reasons. And that's what hopefully the others in the group can talk some about what we see around evidence. But I did want to give just a little bit of background around where we're at with laboratories. Let me share my screen here real quick. You seeing my screen correctly there?
Yes.
Good. So, like every other aspect of the justice system, laboratories are in trouble for resources. National Institute of Justice was required under the reauthorization of the Justice for All Act to do a needs assessment of the state of forensic sciences. And earlier, well, actually late in 2019, right in December, right around the first of the year, they issued this report and had some really sobering numbers in it. One, they estimated in 2017, laboratories, just forensic laboratories, needed in excess of an additional $640 million a year in order to meet what was in 2017 being requested of laboratories. Controlled substances, so the identification of pills, powders, green leafies, those things before they go into a person, had grown more than 37%. Toxicology evidence, which for crime laboratories means driving under the influence of drugs and alcohol and drug-facilitated sexual assault cases, had grown more than 25%. Some of that is an outgrowth of the opioid epidemic, but the growth in laboratory budgets had only grown on average less than 3% to that point. They estimated an additional need of thousands of additional practitioners needed every year in order to try and meet those demands. And they did point out that federal funding, and this is something that I find a lot of people don't necessarily catch. They hear all of these various places where federal funding has been authorized, and there is, for DNA, and almost exclusively DNA. There are dedicated funds for nothing else. And it really, when you think about the majority of cases that move through laboratories, actually are not DNA cases, they're drug cases, they're toxicology cases. But there is no federal funding available to laboratories for anything other than DNA work. And, you know, this is something that laboratories spend a lot of time trying to get policymakers to understand what's going on with this. But all of the aspects of the justice system have recurrent resource issues like this. So even if we get the laboratories solved, that backlog, that issue will move someplace else. So it's made me think, what are areas that would affect everything across the system that are, they're not easy to fix, but they're at least clear of what needs to get fixed. And evidence handling has been one of those things because it affects everything in the system. So I often find myself talking about it from this standpoint. Anybody who's in a laboratory, I'm sure recognizes this. So this is a sealed envelope. I think this might have been Leighton Lefkard, Leighton Prince case, but this is kind of the classic of what we deal with. So an appropriate evidence seal is tamper evident tape across the opening with initials and dates. Well, that's great. On the right-hand side of that envelope, we have a correct and complete seal. On the left-hand side of the envelope, the actual end of the envelope that opens, I don't. So what do I do with this as a laboratory? Well, what we end up doing with this as a laboratory is we document that we don't have an appropriate seal there, and we carry on, because if I were to actually reject that piece of evidence, I would reject almost everything that comes to our borders. This is one of those subtle, maybe it's not necessarily a fatal flaw in the evidence, but it is a result of improper packaging. Now, it's really, really easy to lay the fault of this at the feet of whoever it was that submitted this. I would say this is really more the result of, again, an engineering challenge, that packaging is not engineered to make this as easy as we can for that individual to get it packaged properly. Which end do I seal? Do I have to seal both ends? Do I have to initial both ends? How do I mean, don't make multiple options on it. Design it to be easier, but that means somebody's got to watch this stuff. I use one example of one piece of evidence to just hopefully illustrate the kind of impact that this can have across everything. So we had in 2014 here in Houston, we had an officer submit 2 cases inverted. They actually were a blood case and a breath case for toxicology inverted. So he had the 2 cases mixed up. Laboratory realized it, but the laboratory at that point went ahead and processed and reported the results out incorrectly. So shame on the laboratory. So that resulted in issues with the state commission. It resulted in a variety of pretty serious problems for the laboratory for those cases. Actually set off a long and arduous courtroom path for those cases. But that was just before the formation of Houston Forensic Science Center. So in 2015, when I first showed up and realized the implications that that crossed up case was having for that particular type of evidence, we decided that we would stop processing and we would reject anything that came in that was not unambiguously identified, said Martha on the tube and Bob on the paperwork, because that's about what we were seeing. If it was that, we were going to reject it, send it back to the submitting agency with a letter that said, your evidence has been rejected, please try again. When we started doing that, we were rejecting nearly half of all toxicology evidence that came to us. Over the course of the next few months, we were able, through training and a lot of policy changes, to get that down to about 20%, but that's all we could do. And part of that was the engineering of the kit itself. The way the kit was put together required an officer to put the name on all of the items, because that's what tied everything together, on no fewer than 6 different places. Well, occasionally they didn't write the same name down in places, or they misspelled it. We had a gap in there in 2016 where we had some technical issues with instrumentation and we were down for production for 2 months. But while we were doing that, we redesigned the kit and we launched that new kit after that. And with that new kit, we were able to get that rejection rate down to about 5 to 6%. Tried to shift the purchasing of that kit back over to the law enforcement agency. However, law enforcement agency is a very large agency. Purchasing kits is a very small thing for them, and the implications for them really weren't that big. So they put the kit out for competitive bid like they were supposed to, and what they were getting back was not actually sufficient for what we as the laboratory needed them to do. So we again started having errors in kits. So we picked back up purchasing the kits for the law enforcement agency so that we could ensure that the kits were built the way they needed so that we could get them through the process. But 6 years later, after all of that, we still hover between a 2 and 6% rejection rate. And 6 years later, after a Texas Supreme Court decision, has actually finally been the final end to that original submission problem. So what seems like should be a pretty small issue has resulted in years of challenges trying to get it straightened out. And this is just one piece of evidence, one of hundreds of different types of evidence. So, the implications for evidence affect everything: laboratory, law enforcement, prosecution, courts, defense. Everybody is affected by these pieces of evidence. Third thing I want to point out about why I think evidence is something we should all be paying attention to, and something where we need to focus some efforts that will help the entire system. So this is just an example in Houston with Houston Police Department, who manages the property room that feeds us largely. If you look at the number of items of evidence that they receive versus the items of evidence that they're able to dispose of, you make a ratio of that. That is basically the picture of what a nuclear meltdown looks like in evidence. Last year, they were up to a 7-to-1 ratio, more than a 7-to-1 ratio. So they receive 7 items for every 1 they're able to dispose of. Why the disposal problem is multiple factorial. It's all kinds of things from within the property room to stuff that's outside of their control. But when you receive 7 items and you're only able to dispose of 1, that ratio will crush any operation. And all that means is you've got a property room that is moving deck chairs on the Titanic. They are constantly trying to find space, and they're unable to pay attention to making any progress. And you can see that ratio is getting worse. Now, that's Houston specifically. Most any property operation I talk to around the country, this is more the picture than where you want to be, which is a less than 1 ratio. In other words, you dispose of slightly more than you receive so you can maintain the footprint. But that's not where most property is in the country. So property affects everything. You think it affects law enforcement, from lost time and inconsistent policies and frustration on the part of officers who are faced with multiple different ways of packaging things, no consistent policies to do it, the administrative overhead of going and fighting with their property room. It affects laboratories because we get poor quality evidence. I can't fix something if it's contaminated or damaged. Doesn't matter how good the science is. If the evidence is no good, the result's going to be no good. We lose resources all the time to remediation, and it increases the risk of a poor outcome. For prosecution, inconsistent policies. Often prosecution and DA's offices are dealing with multiple different agencies in multiple different ways evidence is packaged. It is a huge bottleneck for DAs in the transfer of evidence between them, the courts, and law enforcement. Increased risk of poor outcome. Defense, they're faced with inconsistent policies, poor quality evidence that compromises the case, a lack of transparency and an inability to understand where things are at, and it creates an issue for disclosure, which ultimately affects both defendants and victims, because lost and damaged evidence affects both of them. An opaque system reduces trust in system, and you risk an unjust outcome. So I will leave one little thing to think about, because there is the improvement to the system, but I think this also makes economic sense to fix this, because for us, going back to that toxicology example, a toxicology kit that's correct takes us 6 minutes to get it in the door and on into the technical side of the house and the testing. An incorrect kit, however, typically blows up into something that takes us about an hour to process and report back out. I'm guessing, conservatively, I think, that incorrect kit is going to oblige the officer now to probably about 2 hours to go back to the property room, figure out what was wrong, correct it, deal with the property room, and then probably pull himself out of the tree from the frustration of dealing with the property room. And then for prosecution and the courts, probably at least 3 hours, because now there are going to be questions about the integrity of that sample that didn't have to be there. All of those issues around the things that compromise the case and questions that didn't have to be there if it were correct to begin with. So you think about this, at our 6% rejection rate, that means about 390 rejections a year for us. That's about 2,400 excess labor hours in the system, just from that conservative estimate of the time that it takes for those 390 rejections per year. One type of evidence in one laboratory in one city in the country. And that's not even calculating what about things that really do go sideways because of errors in it. I can't even estimate the cost of the unjust results. So if nothing else in evidence gets fixed, and I think Joe will talk about this some, the disposal process is a huge and serious impending issue for all of the property operations in the country. They are getting buried in evidence, and when they're buried in evidence, they can't do it right. And all of this helps to improve the trust in the system. And a question that I keep asking is, property management is very high risk. You drop something, you're in the news. Does this have to be a risk that law enforcement has to do? Traditionally, they've been the ones managing property. But if this could go elsewhere, why oblige law enforcement to take on a risk when we oblige them to take on so many other risks? Why do they need to take on this risk? Can we distribute this risk elsewhere to make life easier for law enforcement and things better for the system? So in what we've got today, Akila will talk about the implications of property. Jerry's going to talk some about crime scene collection and that interface of crime scene investigation with property. Joe's talking about accreditation of property rooms and the national scheme there. And then Stacy's talking about sexual assault kits, which is a particular type of evidence, but one that's obviously very high visibility and one that has been part of a national discussion for quite some time. So with that, let's see, I need to stop sharing my screen, which is over here. And then, John, I think we tossed to Akila, don't we?
I think that's right. Yes. Akila,
all right, Akila.
All right, let me share my screen. All right, my name is Akila Mance, and I am the General Counsel for Houston Forensic Science Center. And today I'm going to talk just a little bit about the importance of evidence in the courts, as well as how this discussion we're having, particularly about evidence management and property rooms, how that conversation has a big impact on our courts today. And I actually wanted to sort of pick up on an idea that John mentioned as we began this topic, which is, you know, evidence management is an important conversation for us to have, but it's often overlooked. And so as I address this topic today, I really wanted to challenge myself and my colleagues who are attorneys and even judges in the court system to think about evidence management and how it impacts the very obvious conversations that we have around evidence. I'm happy to discuss those big issues, some of which I've seen folks discussing already. But I think if we are to make a real impact here, we have to think beyond just the normal conversations and topics. So I'm happy to try to present that to you all here today. Dr. Stout did kind of start us off with thinking about various stakeholders that we have in the criminal court system. And I wanted to take a moment to give us sort of a high level understanding of those stakeholders, as well as what the law says about their role and their responsibility. Obviously, when you think about our courts and our criminal system, the first individuals who are impacted that we think of are the accused, as well as crime victims. When you think about most of your constitutional rights that are associated with our courts, they are associated with individuals who are charged with a crime, the accused, defendants if they're formally charged. And those rights include, you know, making sure that you are protected from unwarranted and unreasonable searches and seizures, having the right to not give a statement, to testify against yourself, to incriminate yourself, being able to be tried by a jury of your peers, due process. All of those constitutional rights regarding our courts, we tend to think first and foremost of the accused, which, you know, for good reason. It's their life and liberty that is at stake. On the other hand, a lot of people may not be aware that there are a lot of laws which protects our crime victims. In fact, here in Texas, we have that in our Constitution, talking about the Victims' Bill of Rights and what victims are entitled to know about their case, what the prosecutors are doing sometimes victims' compensation, or even writing a statement to be placed in the file that talks about your impact as a victim. We know that prosecutors and defense attorneys represent the interests of those individuals as well, but they have their own obligations. Here in Texas, again, our prosecutors, their duty is described in the statute. So it's not actually a duty to convict, but it is a duty to seek justice, to see that justice is done. And we also know that prosecutors are required to disclose evidence to defense attorneys in criminal court. So they bear a huge burden and responsibility in making sure that all evidence is provided to the other side so that defense attorneys can do their job, which is to zealously defend and advocate for their clients' interests. Criminal law is quite different from civil law in the sense that, in civil law, both sides get evidence from each other, right? There's discovery for each to disclose from one side to the other. Whereas in the criminal system, the defense attorney is not going to be able to access that information from the state unless and until prosecutors disclose that over to them. And our defense attorneys, our defendants have no obligation whatsoever to provide any evidence to the state. And so those are just some of the high level stakeholders in our system that we're going to be thinking about and talking about here today. One area I did want to point out, in addition to ones that we'll talk about later, the general public. Given our current state in this country and all the very meaningful and important conversations we're having, the general public is a stakeholder who has really stepped up into the conversation to say, wait a minute, even if I'm not a victim, even if I'm not charged with a crime, I care about the system. I want to know that it is performing in a way that does protect the interests of society, but more importantly, the courts actually are providing justice. So from a high level, those are all the stakeholders that we're going to be talking about today. And we know that all of those interests are not always consistent. There are situations where there are competing interests, and that's what our courts are meant to delve into and flesh out. So moving from the high level, we can talk about our current state of courts and the challenges that we face with evidence. I will obviously talk about our courts here in Harris County, as well as my personal experience, having practiced in this area for 12 years now. But I'm almost positive that the same issues and concerns that we're dealing with here in Texas, folks are dealing with across the country. The two graphs that you see here represent the active pending cases here in Harris County. That last update here was at the end of June when folks were looking at the impact of COVID on our courts. But if you look at the numbers, or at least the numbers that I want to highlight for our particular conversation, you see that in our misdemeanor courts, 16 misdemeanor courts that handle exclusively criminal cases in our jurisdiction, that's almost 40,000 active cases. If you look at the chart for felony cases, you see that we're slightly over 41,000. And I can guarantee you those numbers have continued to increase since this document was created. And from the legal perspective, even the court perspective, when we see these numbers, our thoughts immediately go to backlogs, jury trials. Why aren't cases getting disposed of? That's not bringing justice or closure for the defendant or the victims in the case. And that's immediately where our attention goes. I can tell you, being in the legal side of this, being a criminal litigator, I never would have associated these numbers with property management. And if you look at these numbers and you just say, being generous, let's say only half of those cases have property that's actually been tagged. As Dr. Stout mentioned, and our director here, Jerry Pena, will talk about later, you don't just tag one item of evidence. That's rare. If you're talking about an ag rob, a complicated homicide, I know in cases I tried, we're talking over 100 items for you to go through, label, and sift through. So if you just look at these numbers and are conservative about the estimate about how many items of evidence are sitting in property rooms across our jurisdiction for the active cases, then you understand why we have a serious concern that we have to address about property storage. And again, this says nothing of the disposed cases who have evidence items still sitting around in the property room. Now, obviously, some property items need to be there to make sure they're available for retesting, for appeals, but we'll kind of flesh through that a little bit more as we move along. What do our courts expect of us, of the system? The photos here are our crime scene unit at HFSC. One of them includes our next speaker and his staff as well. But the courts, be it the judges, the juries, the attorneys involved, they expect that kind of CSI, forensic files, Law and Order, Snapped, I don't know what you watch, but whatever show you watch, that is absolutely informing the courts about what kind of evidence they expect to see in a case. And I know that when I was litigating cases, that's one of the first things you have to deal with when you're talking to your jurors and your potential jurors is, I know you see these shows, but I can almost guarantee you we're not going to find the speck of blood that fell behind the bed on the left, lamp post, and it just so happens to be, a perfect match to the suspect. It's not going to happen that way. And the challenge that we face in the court system is that we expect our officers to gather this type of evidence for our cases. I know when I started prosecuting cases, over 10 years ago when I was a baby lawyer, I remember I had a DWI case that was no test, no accident, which unfortunately in Harris County, we are, one of the DWI capitals of our nation. And the cases that come in that didn't have a breath test or a blood sample and where no one was, injured in a car accident, they go to the baby prosecutor of the court. And I remember with this case, we had no field sobriety test. We had a video of some of the interaction with the officer. But as it was heading to trial, my chief was really, helping me think about where can you find more tangible evidence that has not been presented yet by the investigating officer. So that was subpoenaing, bar receipts and, going back out and taking photos of the scene again to see if they fairly and accurately still depict how the, location looked at the time. All kinds of things. We used to print out Google Maps, right? I mean, it seems very basic, but we understood even 10 years ago that our courts, our juries are expecting you to bring something they can see, they can touch, they can feel, they can hang their hats on in addition to testimony, although we know that testimony alone is considered evidence. So when we think about this sort of CSI mentality that we bring into our courts, it does have an impact and it does bring challenges that we don't often think about, which are related to property management. In our Code of Criminal Procedure here in Texas, physical evidence means any tangible object, thing relating to a criminal action. And so when we think about that in all of our discussions, particularly panels like this, we're thinking toxicology, firearms, biology, DNA, prints, like those are the things that we are thinking about when we say we need to deal with evidence storage and management. When the truth of the matter is, when we talk about physical evidence, look at the last part of that definition here. It says relating to a criminal action. It doesn't say, that would help or tend to help prove or disprove an element of the case. It doesn't say relevant. It says anything relating to a criminal action. So it makes sense, and we can see why when an officer is on the scene processing a scene and there's a lot of stuff there, you're going to have a tendency to get as much as you possibly can, even if you're not 100% sure that it relates to the case. You're going to collect it and tag it into property because you don't want to mess up and overlook something. That makes sense, but what it yields in reality is what we see here, which are images from our property room here in Houston. I had the wonderful pleasure of touring this facility with my colleagues on the panel in the past. And I will tell you that we walked through the expected areas of like, okay, here's DNA and here's, you know, firearms, drugs, and things that you would expect. But then there are rows of things like random bikes. Random bikes that absolutely can't be ridden anymore, that absolutely probably have zero evidentiary value after, I mean, I don't even know. They probably been there 10, 15 years. Look at the picture on the right. You know, those are cheap. We don't even have TVs with that back anymore. Okay, so can you imagine how long that evidence has been sitting there? And I think that the courts and the attorneys and the judges are doing ourselves a disservice by not taking an interest in figuring out what is the right solution. How do we protect the rights of the accused to make sure the evidence is there and available, that it's still around if we need to have subsequent testing, if we have a situation where there's an exoneration or appeals have not been exhausted. Of course, that's not, you know, we're going to consider that and not destroy evidence that is still a part of a criminal action. But for the random rows of bikes, is there not a solution that we can think of collectively so that when that DNA does come in on your case, when that blood vial, when that firearm does come in your case, it has a place to go, it can be properly stored and maintained and available for the court system to consider. Another challenge that I know attorneys think about all the time when you're dealing with evidence, particularly here in Harris County, every agency that I've listed here is a law enforcement agency or an agency that has law enforcement functions in our jurisdiction that can and do file charges in our courts. So thinking back to that slide with 80,000 cases, now take those 80,000 cases and you can just sprinkle across, sorry, let me get that out here. You can just sprinkle across all of these different jurisdictions. Think about what that looks like when you're the attorney, when you're the court, and you're trying to figure out, first of all, what evidence do I have in my case? Sometimes it's listed in the report, sometimes it's not. Sometimes your report is not yet complete. Once you have the list of evidence that you believe has been tagged or you believe should have been tagged based on what you're reading, then you have to figure out each and every law enforcement agency, how do they, you know, maintain their property? Who's the proper contact to get that evidence? And you can spend not only countless time trying to track it down, but then just waiting for it to arrive. And again, most of these agencies, even the smallest agencies, there's not just one person that you reach out to get evidence. There's email individual A if you want your videos, your body cams. If you want a 911 tape, then fax, you know, this form, not fax anymore, email this form to a different contact. And so all of those challenges are seen every single day in our courts that we don't really think of as an issue of evidence management. We think about it in, you know, a very different context. So when I did my personal poll and thought about my personal experience as a criminal litigator, when you talk about biggest concerns with evidence in the court system, I guarantee you, you know, attorneys aren't talking about evidence management. If you say evidence, what's the problem? First and foremost, it's always slow response to requests for evidence. I don't care how great you think your system works. When you're in the courts, you are going to find frustration with not getting evidence in a timely manner. And that obviously further delays cases. But again, when you're talking about reform and where the court's attention is placed, you can see why, again, it's not been focused particularly on evidence management. The other big concern, timely and accurate analysis of evidence. Ask this question to my colleagues, And it's like, why is it taking so long for me to get my stuff back? My blood results, my, whatever, my DNA, whatever the case might be. And I would tell you that even if you have great turnaround times in 90% of your sections, if there's a backlog or if there's a slowdown in any one section, then the entire court system perceives that nothing is turned around timely. And so that's always going to be in the forefront of their mind, particularly if you have a case as someone who's charged with a crime or someone who is a victim of crime. Absolutely, you're going to be concerned about the turnaround time for the evidence in your case because it does impact your life directly. Also, evidence collection, as well as admissibility and interpretation. Those are the biggest concerns you're going to hear from lawyers and judges time after time, regardless of jurisdiction. Evidence management, property management in the courts doesn't typically become an issue until you look at when it goes wrong. So something mislabeled, something destroyed, something not suitable for analysis, or not available for trial. That's the only time that we tend to associate property or evidence management with the concerns we have. And so just in closing this out, I think it's important for the courts, for the attorneys, for the judges to really begin to prioritize evidence management and see how it can be directly related to the obvious concerns with evidence that we have. So if you're talking about slow response time, when you have all these different agencies with all these different ways to handle things, and when you're using police officers to be evidence managers, not just at the property room, but if you want a request or you want a copy, a lot of times the attorneys are reaching out directly to the officer because they have to bring it down to court or they have to request that copy to be made. So there are a lot of places where evidence management comes into play, but we don't really think about it. And I want to challenge my colleagues to think about evidence management in a different way. And then my very last slide, I will say we absolutely need attorneys and judges to help address issues of evidence destruction or disposition. It serves nobody in the system to have rows of bikes and TVs and lawnmowers and washing machines. And I mean, if you went into the property room, you would be amazed that the things are there. And I know that there are several laws that govern disposition of evidence. So that's something that is a legal matter that our officers are not going to be equipped to handle alone. And I just would challenge the attorneys and judges to find some middle ground where they can meet to just begin, be it low-level misdemeanors, where you know about the statute of limitations, you know about all of the appeals being exhausted, or even, hey, everybody can get together and figure out how to dispose of the 500 bikes. Any place is a good place to start, because if we don't, we're going to be in big trouble in all areas. So let me stop sharing here, and I'm going to pass it over to Jerry.
Thanks, Akila. Before Jerry gets started, I'm obligated to let everybody know that the second CLE password is cheesesteak. So we're staying with the Philadelphia theme. So cheesesteak is the second CLE code. And Jerry, over to you. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jerry Pena, and I am the director here at the Houston Forensic Science Center. Thanks, John, for giving me the title of doctor. However, I don't hold a doctorate, so that's not my title, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn one time, so that might count. So, all right, who are we? To know who the crime scene unit and the Houston Forensic Science Center are, you must first know where we came from. This was a headline back in 2003 that deemed the Houston crime lab as the worst crime lab in the country, according to the New York Times. It was just riddled with analytical errors, and which led to exonerations in many cases. And this was what we had to overcome. This is what we inherited. This is what we had to overcome. Next slide, please. So today, moving forward to 2012 was when the Houston Forensic Science Center was formed, local government corporation, to oversee the operations of the Houston Police Department's forensic science services, which included the crime scene unit as well. In April of 2014, the Houston Forensic Science Center took management control of the Houston Police Department's crime lab, and the crime scene unit and certain parts of the identification unit of the Houston Police Department. Made up of a 9-person volunteers board of directors. The head of the board was appointed by the mayor, and the board of directors are confirmed by the Houston City Council. Our corporate structure, we have a CEO and president, which is Dr. Peter Stout, and he reports directly to the board of directors. Next slide, please. What we do, we have 7 forensic disciplines, nearly 30,000 cases a year is what we work at the Houston Forensic Science Center, with a little more than 200 in our staff. Some of the disciplines include the crime scene section, the seized drugs section, toxicology, multimedia, which is audio, video, and digital, the latent print section, forensic biology, DNA, and the firearms section. And then our administrative functions, we have the quality, client services, case management, finance, business, management, communications, PIO, our legal team, which is Aquila, you met her, and our human resources division. Next slide, please. The Houston Forensic Science Center's crime scene unit responds to a limited number of calls, and that's mainly based because of the staff that we have available, and we can only answer so many calls. Houston is 4th, 5th, depending on who you talk to, 4th, 5th, maybe 6th largest city in the country. And we're probably right up there in the top 5 as crime is concerned. And so all our crime scene unit can respond to are officer-involved shootings, homicides, child death investigations, sexual assaults, aggravated robberies, and of course, any vehicles that need forensic analysis or forensic processing goes to the vehicle examination building, which the crime scene unit is also responsible for processing those vehicles. Next slide, please. This was a headline in 2016. HPD wants its crime scene unit back. Crime lab civilian leadership says no. They go on to say that in the past we had a problem with rape kits, we had a problem with processing of evidence, but we didn't have a problem with CSU. Interesting, because the next slide, which is almost a year later in 2017, crime scene errors put 65 cases under review, audit finds. These were serious cases that evidence was mishandled, documentation was shoddy at best. There was a lot of complications with the manner and method in which the crime scene were approached, and it led to the president of the Houston Police Officer Association at the time, Mr. Ray Hunt, giving this quote: "I'm tired of every time they have a problem, they want to put the blame on police officers," said Ray Hunt. So let's let it lie where it belongs, on the management of the Houston Forensic Science Center. Okay, good. We'll accept that responsibility, and we moved on. Next slide, please. Of course, transition of this magnitude doesn't happen without some tough challenges. Sworn personnel being managed by civilian personnel, the contrast between the Houston Police Department's general orders that the officers abide by, as well as the standard operating procedures established by the Houston Forensic Science Center. and of course the overall approach to crime scene investigation. Next slide, please. Turning the page, 2017, the Houston Forensic Science Center hosted its first CSI Academy. This consisted of over 400 hours of combined classroom, practical, field, and courtroom testimony training for the cadets, crime scene investigators, trainees. In 2018, the Houston Police Department's officers were transitioned out back to the Houston Police Department, and the Houston Forensic Science Center incorporated its first all-civilian crime scene investigation unit. 2018, the crime scene unit achieved accreditation through ANAB's ISO 17025 program. And here recently this year, we partnership with the National Forensic Academy to train our crime scene investigators. And these are individuals that meet the educational requirement, but do not have any formal crime scene investigation training or experience. So they're going into the National Forensic Academy located in Tennessee, and they're getting their basic training from them. Normally this takes years and years for those that are in the field and understand or know what the National Forensic Academy is. The prerequisite for needing that and being accepted to the National Forensic Academy, it's a long list. So for us to have this partnership with them, it really helps us out a lot. Another thing that we just recently did in this year was we incorporated the OSAC standards, which is the Organization of Scientific Area Committees for Forensic Science standards, into our standard operating procedures. So we're now following OSAC guidelines in the crime scene unit. Next page. Part of what we do most of is the crime scene investigation, special investigations, and that consists of crime scene meets with the Houston Police Department's Special Investigations Unit to create a game plan. The Special Investigation Unit is a specialized unit within the Homicide Division that responds to all officer-involved shootings. Each team member consists of a lieutenant, a sergeant, and 4 investigators that work in the SIU department. And both the crime scene unit and the SIU work together to establish what we have called the crime zone. And this is important as we move forward. Oh, went too fast there. Right there. Next slide. Right there. All right. You're asking, what is a crime zone? The crime zone is the immediate location within the scene that is where the most sensitive evidence is located, which includes the body or bodies. This is an area designated with red crime scene tape. And as you saw in Akila's presentation, she was able to show where we had strung up some red crime scene tape at one of our officer-involved shootings. HFSC and HPD agree on this procedure. That dictates that everybody entering the crime zone will have their name logged into the crime scene log, as well as down the required personal protective equipment, PPE. And at minimum, that is gloves, a mask, and shoe covers. We do set up an area right outside of the crime scene, designated as the workstation, where all the required PPE that is needed inside the crime zone is staged there, and anybody entering and exiting can down the PPE or properly discard it in biohazard baskets that we have there. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of the crime zone. Traditional yellow tape is strung up by the Houston Police Department, and they do an excellent job of setting the perimeter. for onlookers and as well as the media. It's the responsibility of the crime scene unit and or the special investigation unit, depending on who arrives at the scene first, of establishing the crime zone. The crime zone is where the red tape goes up, and that's the restricted area. The crime zone, keep in mind, we can adjust the size of the crime zone based on the evidence and the size of the scene. If we need to expand it, we can definitely do so. If we need to reduce it, which we've done numerous times, we go ahead and reduce the crime zone to include just the immediate area where we need to function and do our job properly. Next slide, please. Here's a good early on wherein we started with the crime zone. You can see, the yellow and red tape being present. These are homicide special investigation unit detectives. They're inside the crime zone, and they're wearing the proper PPE and are recording evidence for their case folder as well. Next slide.
Sorry, my computer seems to be freezing.
That's all right.
Is that what you want, Jerry, there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Next slide, please.
Okay.
This is prior to crime scene unit arriving to this officer-involved shooting. You can see they've done a great job establishing a perimeter with the yellow tape. But what's the problem here? You see officers in the crime zone, or which will later be determined the crime zone, and none of them present are wearing any sort of PPE. We do have evidence throughout the parking lot here. There's a rifle, which you'll see in the next slide. And there's some additional evidence, but nobody is wearing any kind of protective equipment. Next slide, please. Here's another example of that. Next slide, please. Here you see some of the early responders hovering over what is the weapon used by the perpetrator. And as we all know that DNA is very sensitive, talking over it, hair follicles, skin cells, could fall on this evidence and contaminate it. So again, this was early on prior to, right after the crime zone was established. So these officers, I'm sure, were still in the process of learning what the crime zone was. And we've come a long ways from this point. Go ahead, next slide. So scene processing. Officer involved shooting processing is consistent with a typical homicide. CSIs respond to the scene. They take their field notes. They do their photography, their videography, 3D scanning with the Faro, their measurements. They do and all the officers involved in the shooting that discharge a weapon, their officers are charted. What we mean by that is that the officer hands over the weapon to the crime scene investigator. The investigator will document that weapon completely with the ammunition and any additional rounds that the officer may have for that weapon that he used. There's complete documentation of the number of rounds, the position of the weapon, the hammer. If it's a cylinder weapon, then the cylinder is charted as well. So very detailed photographs are taken to that as well as notes. CSIs do not take part in the walkthrough. The walkthrough is when the officer goes with the HPD Special Investigations Unit. Usually the chief is involved, the training coordinator is involved, the Houston Police Union has a representative there. They kind of walk through, the process that they followed during the officer-involved shooting. We intentionally state we don't take part in that walkthrough because we don't want our investigation to be biased. It's an independent investigation. Usually at these scenes, both the both myself, the director, and my deputy director are there, and we play as a liaison to our stakeholders. In this case, most of the time our stakeholder is the Houston the Houston Police Department is who we're servicing. But we do play a critical role there to determine the chain of events, what action is going to take place next, what special tactics or investigations are going to be needed, and are there any search warrants needed? What is going to be required? Is there any reconstruction? Do we need to maintain the scene for a period of time? So there's a lot of follow-up that we don't want to get our investigators that are working the scene involved with, because that just takes them away from the investigative part of it. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide, but this is to give you an idea of the productivity and the quality of the latent print processing, which all ends up in the property room. So it all ties back, everything ties back to the property room. The more we can process on scene and not have to submit to the property room, the better off we are. But early on in 2014, you can see the number of cases where latent prints were collected or processed for and collected, which were 6. And we evolved over the years since becoming fully civilianized in 2017. You can see where the process for latent prints has increased, as well as the latent print submission. So the overall quality of what the Houston Forensic Science Center Crime Scene Unit does has improved tremendously. Our biggest struggle right now is just keeping up with the ever-growing crime rate, which is every major city's challenge right now, as well as having enough staff on duty to be able to answer those calls. As it is, we don't have sufficient bodies in our crime scene unit to be able to answer every call. We don't handle any property crime calls. And we all know how the criminal element works. They start off in property crime calls, and most of the time that continues to escalate until they reach to major crimes. And if we were able to actively or proactively identify these criminals in the early stages of the criminal life, then perhaps we could, prevent them from moving on and committing more major crimes in the future. That is all I have for you guys. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Jerry. I'm going to jump in here and let everybody know the third code, which is Bluebonnet. So if you're looking for CLE, Bluebonnet is the code BLUEBONNET.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Joe Latta. I've retired from Burbank PD. I'm the executive director of IAPE, which conduct property and evidence training classes. We've been doing it for about 20 years here around the country. Some real quick numbers on our world here. Yeah. It's really struggling here. We've instructed about 28,000 people in the last 35 years. We've been teaching classes. We've done about 850 classes in all 50 states, most all of the provinces in Canada. And I've done about 100 audits in my career, including one in Houston about 10 years ago. So I have a good understanding of what the Houston Police Departments, the way they were doing things a number of years ago. What I bring to this presentation is I've just seen a lot of property rooms. We've been all over the country, and we have some real problems out there. It's not just a department, it's the industry itself. I believe that Peter said that they get the stuff that is poor to analyze. Well, understand a lot of the stuff never goes to the crime lab, and we get a lot of it that's poor. And those are some of the audits that I've done in my career. And that's the state that people are having to work in. And I think if you went to work every day, you would say that's quite depressing. And that's not unusual. It makes me very unhappy. So let's talk for a few minutes about the different challenges that we have and the liabilities. When I say challenges, everyone, for just a minute, I'm going to kind of give you some topics I'd like to talk about for just a couple of minutes. Is first of all, administrative knowledge, policies and procedures, staffing, inventory levels, purging, automation, management oversight, audits, inspections, inventories, and certification and accreditation. I'm going to make a very bold statement, and I can say this after teaching all the classes. When it comes to administrative knowledge, and I'm talking about sergeants, lieutenants, captains, police chiefs, and sheriffs, we always ask the question in a class to understand how much knowledge they have it. So the question is, what percentage of law enforcement administrators have worked in the property room and fully understand all the nuances of it? If we had 10% of law enforcement administrators have any knowledge of what we do in the property room, that would be a lot. That number may be exaggerated, and that's no one's fault. You go to work for a police department and you advance through the ranks, and property and evidence probably only, maybe only 1% of your employees in the overall organization have any knowledge of it. It's kind of like that thing that's buried in the corner. Remember, as a police officer, a deputy sheriff, we've been chasing bad guys for our whole career and managing, and I call it stuff because we have a lot of stuff. That's not in their knowledge base. They do not have any accounting principles or anything on organizing property rooms. And a lot of times they'll go into a broken property room and they don't know how to fix it, but they don't even know that that's not the norm. While everybody was talking today, I added this slide on there. If I were the chief, I would really like maybe somebody else to take care of it for me. I would love for somebody else to take care of it. I don't want it. It's just a pain for me because we have this constant rotation through there. We don't have good policies and procedures. Oh, let's talk about policies and procedures. What percent of departments have adequate policies and procedures? Of all the 100 audits I've done, I would say if it was 20%, I would be delighted. And if you're good at math, 20 from 100, 80% don't have good policies and procedures. And we throw people into the property room and they basically don't have anything to go by. When it comes to staffing, this is the scary one. If you look at the United States, and it kind of goes up into Canada also, it's very similar to this. You get into the Northeast, you have all sworn police officers. And that's because they've always done it that way. It's not a right or wrong or good or bad. And you get more towards, Texas and going towards the West Coast, lots and lots and lots of civilians. Here in California, I would imagine 95% of the evidence custodians are civilians. You get into the Northeast and it's going to be exactly the opposite. If you look real close to the red arrow there, I'm pointing to Baltimore. They are right now in the process of civilianizing their property room. Now, if you look down at the bottom of the screen, we have about 18,000 law enforcement agencies out there. And you may not know this, but probably about half have fewer than a dozen police officers. So the property room isn't a job, it's an assignment that you go in there for an hour or two a week, and that's about it. So a lot of those small departments, which is about half, they don't get any training. And all they do is go into the room and put it on the shelf, and that's about it. And they have no idea about standards or anything else. Okay. I would always civilianize the property room. I would do the custodians, the supervisors, the managers. You don't need sworn status in the property room. Now, again, very small police departments, you may not be able to do that. But whenever possible, I would try to accomplish that goal. I want to make it a profession, not an assignment. And the biggest problem we have in law enforcement is we rotate people in and out of, especially on the sworn side. We rotate them through assignments, and you go in there for a short period of time. You sort of kind of understand what's going on. Then we get rotated out, and there's no consistency whatsoever. And I have to say, there are a lot of really good property rooms out there, but you get into this situation where there's a lot of people that just never get any training whatsoever. What percent of property rooms have adequate number of personnel? And some of the previous speakers talked to this today. And I'm going to give you this number. I come from a department of less than 200, and we had for about 12 years a 1-to-1 ratio. And that means if 100 items came in, we got rid of 100 by the end of the year. And we typically took in about 1,000 a month. We get rid of 1,000. But we had the right number of people. We had good software. Everything was properly barcoded, and we had the support of management within the organization. I would say 5 to 10% of the people that we teach in our classes can say they're getting rid of as much as they're taking in. And I think in Houston, they were talking about a 7-to-1 ratio. And folks, if you keep that 7-to-1 ratio, all of a sudden your new warehouse is full, and then you build another new warehouse and another new warehouse, and it just never stops. And we're going to give you some numbers here. I want you to imagine, and this is one of the audits that I did. This is a typical law enforcement agency. And if you look back 10 years ago, they were taking in about 12,000 items a year. Last year, they took in 19,000. Everybody, the blue is going in and the pink is going out. Anybody see a problem? And if you look at it, you say, wow, that's horrible. What's the problem here? Because most police administrators don't know they want those numbers. Most police administrators can tell you everything going on in their community. How many shootings, how many traffic accidents, how many of these and how many of those, response time. But very rarely do you find anyone ever say, hey, what's going on in their property and can I compare it? You can't compare property inventories over a year or two. Some departments will do a weekly or a monthly review. That doesn't tell you a thing. You've got to look at it from 5 to 10 years to really get a good understanding of what's going on. And I'm going to make a broad statement. This is probably true. And the information comes from asking in 700 or 800 classes, what % do you think you have in your property that you could actually get rid of? It's beyond the statute of limitations. The case was closed. It was unfounded when it came in. At least 80%. Everyone, 80% of what we have sitting on the shelf, we could probably get rid of, but we don't have the time, we don't have the staffing, we don't have the resources. So insufficient staffing equals horrendous inventories. Very simple. What % of all the evidence ever goes to court? And at least 1%. Some department will argue, some people will argue that 2%, but any way you do it, if you look at it another way, 99% of it never goes anywhere. It's like bad relatives. It just hangs around. And there's another problem we have in property rooms. Let me go to this next slide. 90% of our property rooms don't capture adequate data. They don't know what's coming in. 95% of the departments take in more than they get rid of, which kind of alludes to what we were just saying. Why are the numbers so high? We don't have enough people. We don't have enough time. We don't have good policies, lack of management support. And it's not unusual for a property room to report to a first line supervisor. And they may have, we've had people in our classes that have had 5 supervisors in 7 or 8 years, and they all have a different philosophy about it. And they may not have that much knowledge of inventory control. And it goes back to the support and the knowledge. And in many cases, it's unsatisfactory software. Why do we keep all that stuff? There are very few statutes across the country that govern how long we keep it. We have statutes of limitations on lots of crimes, but I would submit to everybody that's listening right now, we can take 100 items in on a case, and maybe one is that important piece of evidence, and we could have 99 items that the officer collected that may have nothing to do with solving the case. The officer's just taken everything out of the car. When we ask the prosecutors to help us review the case and let us know what's going on, very difficult. They don't have time. You ask the detectives, hey, can I get rid of this? They don't have time. And getting those systems in place, those protocols in place to make all of these things work is not an easy task. And you have to have support from the very top of the organization. And at the top of the association who's never worked in the property room, they would probably like to give you support, but they don't understand it. And the big one out there is, I'm going to call it fear. You ask the detective, can I get rid of this baseball bat from a 1977 vandalism? And they'll come up with a reason, no, we better keep it because, when it's 10 years beyond the statute of limitations. Fear drives a lot of things that go in our property. We better keep it because we better keep all those bikes in the Houston Police Department because there might be a valuable one in there. That's just the fact of life. Purging, what % of property owners have a step-by-step policy to get rid of their stuff? Maybe 10%. This is a frightening thing, folks. We don't have good policies on how to get rid of it. And I guarantee you, if you had an experienced property officer sit down and write that policy, that could be 20 or 30 pages. Because in order to get rid of those things, you're talking about dealing with bunches, that's a good word, a whole bunch of stakeholders out there. And you want to find out something from the court. They may not give you the information right away. It may take you weeks to get an answer back. They may have to go back into their archives and their microfiche to get answers. So it's really tough to get rid of evidence. And again, remember that 1-to-1, that's important. Now, purging issues, I got my horse here saying leading it to the automation issues. This is one that I find it very frightening. What percent of property room personnel feel their computer software is beneficial in managing the evidence, the inventory? And we ask the question in every class, how many of you are happy with your software? And probably 15 to 20%. And those usually are the ones that will have a standalone system, a good property and evidence management system. And I say management system, a lot of the enterprise systems that are out there that have CAD, records management, and property, most of the development time is in the CAD and in the records management side. Property and evidence is not important. It doesn't help make the sale. There are a few out there that are pretty good, but the people that are really happy really have a good standalone system that manages it. I'll say it again, manages it, not just tracks it. Management oversight is always a problem. Let me show you what management oversight looks like where there was no oversight. I would like to ask all of you if you would like to work in those property rooms. And if you look at those, ask yourself, how long did it take for those rooms to look like that? Years. There's a whole bunch of guns, bottom on the left and the second one over the guns. That property room I had done an audit there. That was 19 years of complete mismanagement where nobody paid any attention. That didn't happen overnight. The photograph on the far right, they've been stacking that biological evidence up for years. No supervisor ever went in there and said, this is a safety issue. Is that a good way to do it? No. And I'm sure their supervisor said, hey, that's a good idea. We should do it. Maybe we can put a piece of plywood across every shelf and we get more stuff in there as opposed to maybe purging it. Let's look at good. These are departments that have got good policies, good procedures, and management oversight that cares about the condition. But again, I have to say, quite frequently, the supervisors on the sworn side and managers, they don't know what good is. So, continuing with management oversight. When it comes to audits, inventories, inspections, we don't do them. And the problem is audits and inventories have very different meanings. I can ask in a class, how many of you do an audit? And then I ask them, what is an audit? And you get completely different ideas what an audit should be. And we don't know. I get police administrators calling me, Joe, need to come in and do an inventory. Well, do you want an inventory or an audit? And they're like, I'm not sure. What's the difference? That is not their world. And we struggle. We really do. When it comes to audits, inspections, which we don't do, we should be doing them routinely. They should be scheduled and minimum at least annually, And there are departments out there that have never done any type of audit or inspection whatsoever. The same thing when it comes to inventories. We should be doing those annually with personnel changes. And anytime there is a mishap in the property where something is missing, that may require us to do a full inventory, especially if it looks like there was a theft issue. You say, well, that's almost impossible. I will say one of those departments out there, I'll name them San Diego, they pretty much complete a full inventory every single year, but they've got good software. Everything is barcoded. They work the property room continuously. This week we do this area. This week we do this area. They just do a good job. Everyone, let's talk about accreditation and certification. Our organization, IEPE, we accredit organizations and we certify people. If you are a property officer, you can come to our training, you become a member, and after that, with a year's experience, you can go on and take a test. It's about 50 questions, if I'm not mistaken, but it is based upon our professional standards, and I'll show you that in just a minute. Where the accreditation is, we would have members from our board come in and evaluate, but they're going to evaluate against our standards. And again, I'll show you what that is in a minute. These are some of the departments we've done over the years. In fact, we just did some work in Dubai, which was quite interesting. We had about 2,800 people that have been through our process and become certified in the United States, in Canada, and The Hague at the World Court, which was, they have lots and lots and lots of documents. They don't have a lot of physical evidence as we know it. Some of our challenges when it comes to accreditation, property rooms aren't a science. We use our standards to, we've written our standards around, we have written all of our standards around what I would call best practices. NIST has been developing some recently that we've been working with. I know Houston went through that ISO process. I'm guessing there may be only several departments out there that have been through that. And our challenge in writing any of these standards is when we started writing it, we wanted to use the word shall throughout that. You shall always use 2 people to count money. And in one of our classes, a gentleman raises his hand, he, Joe, he says, I can't use 2 people. And we're saying, no, you have to. You have to use 2 people. He's, Joe, I'm the chief. It's a 1-person police department, and I'm the only one on duty. There is no second person. So that's where our standards get a little bit fuzzy because our shall becomes very difficult to do. You need to turn your evidence in by the end of the shift. Everybody agrees. Everybody will raise their hand. You need to get in by the end of the shift. And then you have a trooper from Montana who says, Joe, I work out of my house. I'm a resident trooper, and I go to headquarters every Friday. And so they have to keep it in their car or keep it in their home. So again, there's another one. You need to do it, but sometimes we can't. You need to do 100% inventory. That's a great idea. So we always say, well, you should do everything possible. Maybe you can do guns, money, and narcotics, but putting rigid rules on it becomes very, very difficult. Now I'm going to depress you even more here. I'm going to talk to you about some of our liabilities. I have been collecting newspaper stories about property rooms for about 20 years, the good and the bad and the ugly. I'm going to see if our sound is going to work on here. That's it.
Guns, drugs, and money from the county's property and evidence room, a major breach. CAKE's Eli Higgins reports the lost evidence is now affecting the prosecution of dozens of cases.
It's very frustrating. It's very embarrassing, to be real honest with you.
Sedgwick County Sheriff Jeff Easter made the difficult announcement Friday afternoon. He says a longtime supervisor has been stealing more than 50,000 pieces of evidence for months from the county's storage building in South Wichita.
There we go. Folks, you notice it's 150,000 is missing, and over 50,000 items in total. Everyone, that did not happen this year. I guarantee you that did not happen this year. That's been going on for a long period of time. They hadn't been doing audits or inventories. 2 people have been arrested.
$150,000 in cash is missing from the Lancaster County Drug Task Force. The Lancaster County District Attorney Heather Adams made the announcement today, noting that her office realized the cash was missing as they worked to review the procedures of the Drug Task Force once she took office in January. She says the discrepancy was discovered in April after an internal audit done by a team from the county detective's office who are not part of the Drug Task Force. The money was seized as a result of about a dozen cases from 2019 or older, and it was kept in a secure location with limited access.
There is no easy way to say this, and I'm not going to diminish its import. This appears in every aspect to be an internal theft, but we must await the complete investigation.
For months. Folks, the interesting thing about this, and it's like a lot of these, after they did the internal audit, they came back with recommendations saying, why do we have that much money in our property and why don't we put it in the bank? I would say 95% of the time, we don't put money into the bank until there's a problem. And then everybody goes, why do we have that much money? And money rarely goes to court.
For months, and is live outside police headquarters with the latest information.
Kevin Burnham, a retired Springfield police officer, is accused of stealing more than $385,000 from the police evidence room.
Everybody, $375,000. He could have retired about 10 or 12 years earlier. He decided to stay on, and he stayed on because he didn't want anybody to unravel what he had been doing. When he got caught, he go through the trial process, and he ends up committing suicide. There's another one in Braintree, Massachusetts, $400,000 and a suicide. There's been a number of suicides in property. And when you read subsequent stories, you find out management oversight, management oversight, management oversight, and poor procedures. Come on.
It's live outside police headquarters with the latest information.
All right, let's talk about guns for just a
Officers
minute.
had to arrest one of their co-workers today after the police chief says an evidence technician was caught stealing jewelry and guns. According to officials there, one of the guns taken out of evidence vault got back onto the streets and was used in a recent murder.
Everyone, that's not good. And as you read the story, and again, there's always subsequent stories. The first comment from the chief, it was isolated. So let's go along with that. There's a gun in your property room. It's been used in a murder, and it's an isolated event. Well, the next news release comes out. There were over 200 guns that they knew were stolen, and when they searched their home, there were 249 guns that they were been given to her husband, who was selling them online. They all went to prison.
Officers had to arrest
And that was last year.
their co-worker.
Come on, we got to go to the next slide here. Come on. Murder, not good. This is another one that's a big problem for us.
Caught on camera tonight, a Prescott Valley police commander is busted in an undercover sting. That is him taking prescription pills from a police storage vault. Fields Mosley shows us more of this video and why the lawman says he did it.
The hidden camera captured Prescott Valley Police Commander Arthur Askew putting pills in his pocket, and another time stuffing handfuls of them into a bag. The prescription pills were in a secure storage after being dropped off as part of an unused medication program. The hidden camera was set up inside the police department after some officers became suspicious of what Askew was doing in the room with the pills. When confronted, the 20-year veteran resigned immediately. Investigators found pills in his office, more than 1,000 of them of all kinds. When he was interviewed by the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office, Askew told them he had become addicted to Percocet after 2 back injuries.
After 2 back injuries, ladies and gentlemen, I must have 24 of these stories, and almost every single one of them are related to someone who has access to the pills and there's some type of injury. It could be an officer taking them out of the box in the lobby. It could come in the property room. We don't have good controls, and it continues with these problems. If someone's working in your property room and here's a secret. If you have somebody in your property room who's gone through a lot of surgeries and they're taking pain pills, maybe find another assignment for a while. Here's another real quick one.
Police headquarters has a drop-off box right outside the front door for people to properly dispose of their prescription drugs.
Where were they going, though? That's the question. Well, according to the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Kenmore police chief was stealing them. 2 Side's Jeff Preval digs deeper.
According to a federal complaint, FBI agents spoke with Kenmore Police Chief Peter Brittenauer Friday about allegations he had been taking prescription pills from this New York State medication.
This program has been great to get the pills off the street, but the way we manage them really needs close attention. Drugs for destruction is a huge target in our property room.
As you guys know, approximately year 2015, Deputy Logan August and Deputy Derek Penny were investigated for stealing marijuana out of the property room. Both were federal investigation. Both were convicted of those crimes and sentenced by a federal judge. After that was over with, my staff did an audit and found other irregularities regarding Logan August and Derek Penny.
Everybody, a little bit of the behind the scene on this one. Ideally, your officers will submit it. Your detectives will make decisions. If it can be destroyed in your property room, is the guardian of it and takes care of the destruction with oversight from a third party. With this one, the 2 detectives came in and said to the property officer, "Hey, listen, we're going out to the dump site today. We'll take some of that drug." And they signed them out, took them out, and they recorded as destroyed with absolutely new. They kept doing this, signing the stuff out for destruction, and the detectives who collected it, there was no separation of duties. So sometimes the way we do things is what gets us in trouble. And this is going to be my last one here. This is probably the last headline.
Good afternoon, Lou and Glenn. The Orange County Sheriff's Department. Good afternoon, Lou and Glenn. The Orange County Sheriff's Department has acknowledged that hundreds of its deputies have violated its policy on how to handle evidence. They're supposed to hand in evidence at the end of their shift, but an internal audit found that hundreds of deputies waited days, some waited weeks, some said they had evidence that never got turned in at all. Those were all the results of that audit I was just talking about. While the Sheriff's Department released a news release about that audit last week, a defense attorney we spoke to said that news release was only put out after he mentioned the audit in a motion he filed for one of his clients.
I'm going to cut that right there. Everybody, if you look at the headline, 15 more deputies considered for criminal charges, August 8th, that number is now at the 30. You know, we've been under the scrutiny of the newspapers and everybody for the last 6 months. And now there's a possibility of 30 officers being charged with not handling the evidence. This is not a property room. This is an evidence issue. But the officers would collect it and not turn it in a timely manner. And they found the evidence all over the place. Okay. So what do we need in the property room? Management support, funding, as we need in the labs, adequate staffing, the right employees, and sometimes that's important. Purging protocols, good policies and procedures, legislative assistance, because more often than not, our laws don't tell us how long we have to keep it. Computerization, automation that actually works, and good industry standards for all of us. Just a little bit about us. We do 2-day live classes in property evidence management. We do a supervisor class. It's 1 day. When I say live, occasionally we do live classes. It's been difficult. We do a 14-hour online, which is the same as our 2-day class. And I think everybody will be delighted with this. We always talk about the 99% of the stuff we keep when we give 1% to the court. The court has as big a struggles as anybody with evidence because they've never had any training. And we've just started doing training classes for courts. We did one for the court clerks in North Carolina, also for in Virginia. And then Virginia has asked us to come back again. So that's just a little bit of information. If you want to find out more about us, we're going to be at www.iape.org. If you want to look at thousands of headlines, go to the homepage and they're all there. So I hope this wasn't as depressing. I didn't want it to be depressing, but property rooms sometimes they're tough and we do have our challenges.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, that's pretty grim, I got to say.
Yeah.
So our last speaker is Stacy Mitchell. Stacy, I'm gonna ask you a question that I've seen a couple times in the chat room, and I know in your role as the chair of the board of the HFSC you take very seriously, which is, you know, if you're in the wrongful convictions business, like we are at the Quattrone Center, and I know Akila, you answered partially this question in the chat room. You know, when Joe starts talking about a 1-to-1 purge rate, that kind of makes the skin on the back of my neck stand up, because we know that so many cases of wrongful conviction are involving, you know, the ability to access evidence long after, you know, statute of limitations or other things have happened with the case. So I'm sure you've got a more nuanced view of, you know, I think 1-to-1 might be good as a general rule, but maybe you could talk about, you know, how wrongful convictions and the various types of wrongful convictions then influences evidence preservation and retention and maintenance.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because that's something that we even talk about amongst ourselves within the Houston Forensic Science Center when we think about cases and our role in the overall of just the management and the whole criminal justice process. Because you know, you're right. Yes, there can be cases that could come back 20 years, 30 years later. And what do? You know, and you know, if there's no evidence, then how do you address that? You know, that wrongful conviction. I think what we have to do is we have to really come together as a whole and start looking at processes, having good policies in place, having good legislation where, you know, where we all try and work together and build the best process possible. I mean, granted, there's not going to be a perfect process because there's always going to be that one-off case. You know, there's always going to be the one-off thing that is going to be like, well, if we'd have just had it, but it just missed that deadline by like a day or two. But I think, you know, it's a dance. It really is. I mean, and I don't think I feel like I'm struggling, but yeah, I am, because, it is a dance, and it's like, how do we make sure that we are neutral in the middle as a forensic science center, but also how do we make sure that we, provide that right answer at the right time, as Dr. Stout always likes to say, and how do we manage that evidence so that there is evidence, that can be relooked or retested at a later date. It's a bigger conversation than just with, a crime laboratory. It's everyone that needs to sit at that table, including legislators, to have that conversation and try and figure something out, a way out. But it starts with good processes in place at the beginning, with evidence identification, collection, and management.
I know that there have been cases where access to the evidence has actually been the biggest issue, and you see some of these pictures of a poorly managed evidence room, and you really get an understanding of how that can be. So certainly access is the first part, and then figuring out which evidence needs to be kept and is at risk, and which evidence doesn't. So, but in any event, I didn't mean to divert you from prepared remarks. I just had seen that coming in the Q&A and wanted to make sure we were addressing it. So thanks for permitting the intrusion.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. I'm Dr. Stacy Mitchell. I am the chair of the board of the directors at the Houston Forensic Science Center. I am also a forensic nurse. I have been a forensic nurse for almost 30 years. I've had the privilege of working in hospitals and starting programs. And you may be more familiar with sexual assault nurse examiner programs, or SANES. And I've set up those programs in not only Virginia, but here in Texas as well. I have worked as a death investigator at the Harris County Medical Examiner's Office and have had that pleasure. I am now, my day job is as a clinical associate professor at Texas A&M University College of Nursing. I am also the director of the Center of Excellence in Forensic Nursing at Texas A&M Health, which is our health science center. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about sexual assault evidence kit management. What do we do? How do we manage those things from the start? Because many times, we see that patient at the hospital, and that's where we start. That's where our process starts. So let's see if I can get my slide moving here. Alrighty, so I have to do my disclaimers for the university. So the opinions in this presentation are mine, not that of Texas A&M, Texas A&M Health, the College of Nursing, or the Center of Excellence, or the Houston Forensic Science Center. And I have no conflicts of interest to report to you. Also that it's copyrighted under Texas A&M Health. So I want to talk a little bit about evidence management and some of the challenges that healthcare has in terms of sexual assault evidence. I would also want to talk about some ways to improve sexual assault evidence management in healthcare. And then I also want to highlight some of the things that NIST is doing, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They are doing some wonderful things related to evidence management that I've had the privilege to be involved in. Okay, so again, best management of sexual assault kits. Best practices for evidence collection. This is really important in the sexual assault case because we see this on, the media. It's out there, sexual assault and evidence and backlogs and all of these things are just, it's just thrown at us on a daily basis. And when we think about evidence, that's kind of what the media goes to. And that's what the public hears about is sexual assault evidence and the backlogs. But I don't want to just focus on backlogs. I want to talk about the entire management process. And I want to today focus on the healthcare provider and the challenges that we have in terms of managing evidence. So where does sexual assault evidence start? Jerry talked about evidence management challenges at a crime scene. Joe talked about evidence management challenges in the property rooms. And so I want to take that shift and take another step backwards and look at the healthcare arena, healthcare facilities and sexual assault evidence. Because really, you can have the scene where the sexual assault occurred, but you also have the patient who has potential evidence that needs to be collected from their body, be it clothing, be it some type of swabbings for potential DNA, be it injuries that we need to document. So there's more than just that crime scene, the location. there's also the patient that's involved. And one of the things that really struck me about this, about forensic nursing and about forensic science and evidence collection when I first started, was that law enforcement is really entrusting me as a healthcare provider to know what I'm doing, you know, when it comes to collecting evidence, and that, you know, they're saying, here, you know, help us take this evidence, you know, collect these swabs from this patient. And they're trusting that the hospital, the emergency room nurse knows what they're doing. And honestly, back in the 1990s, before we had many forensic nursing programs, when I was getting started as a forensic nurse, it was pretty scary. You know, before I started forensic nursing, it was the luck of the draw as to who had that exam room. And that's where you went, and you were, you know, that's your patient, and we might see you in a few hours. Or while you're in the middle of collecting evidence, you have 2 or 3 other room assignments, and someone's knocking on the door saying, hey, when are you going to go and take care of these other patients? So there were a lot of challenges that we were facing. And some hospitals do face those today. We have more than 600 forensic nursing programs or sexual assault nurse examiner programs in the United States. But that's not enough. We have more hospitals than that. You know, there's hospitals everywhere. Patients present to hospitals, to urgent care centers, to standalone emergency rooms, to, you know, children's advocacy centers. They're presenting to freestanding sexual assault centers. And so there's a lot of diversity in how evidence is identified, managed, and handled in healthcare. So what kind of evidence? What are we looking for? Well, it's more than evidence collection when a patient presents to me at the hospital, to the emergency department. It is about the entire medical forensic examination. So it's medical and forensic. And there's a process for this. There's the triage process. There's a medical screening where we have to make sure by federal law that a patient has no emergent life-threatening injuries or conditions that need to be treated right away. And what does that do to evidence? If there is a life-threatening injury, say there is a gunshot wound or a stab wound, or there's some blunt trauma that needs to be evaluated and treated right away, there is the potential that evidence could be lost. But we look at it from a healthcare perspective, at least for forensic nursing, that we would rather have a live patient than someone who is deceased and a whole lot of evidence. We want that person to live. We want that person to survive. So once the triage and the medical screening piece is completed, then comes the forensic nurse. And we obtain a history of what happened. We want to know, you know, their medical history, their social history, there any kind of medications they're on that may impact what we're doing or impact any medications that we may need to provide as treatment throughout the examination. We also want to know what happened, the details of the event, because the details do help us plan how we're going to collect evidence, plan what places we really want to focus on. What types of evidence or what types of instruments do we need to prepare so that we can collect evidence and collect those samples. We also conduct a physical examination, which is head to toe. We document injuries. We use the sexual assault evidence collection kit to help us collect those evidence in cases of sexual assault. And then there's discharge referrals to local rape crisis centers, to additional medical treatment for psychiatric or mental health follow-up. And then if, depending on the age of the patient, there can be mandatory reporting requirements that we're required by law to follow. We also, not only, there are forensic nursing programs that do collect evidence from suspects as well. And that's a whole other lecture and a whole other dynamic of evidence management in terms of what if the suspect comes to the hospital, is brought to the hospital when the victim is still there. And how do we address that? Where do we do where do we collect the evidence? Who gets to collect that evidence? And so there's a whole other litany of issues that healthcare facilities have to address when they are collecting evidence from suspects. So what guides our forensic evidence collection and management in our healthcare facilities? Well, there's several documents and that I put up here, and there's some examples. In Texas, we have the Texas Evidence Collection Protocol, which through a partnership with the Office of the Attorney General, who manages that here in Texas, the Texas A&M University, we helped update that protocol. That protocol had not been updated since 1998. So 22 years later, we now have an evidence-based protocol that talks about evidence and evidence collection. Although we don't go into detail about evidence management, and that's something for the next update. There's a national best practices for sexual assault kits, a multidisciplinary approach that was created through the National Institute of Justice. They talk a little bit about evidence collection and chain of custody, but really not that whole management piece that we have to think about in healthcare. You know, where do I put it? How do I keep, you know, the evidence preserved, or how do I preserve it? How do I manage it? How do I store it? How do I release it? When do I release it? Who do I release it to? That there's very little guidance for healthcare providers in that document. And there's very little guidance in the national protocols for sexual assault medical forensic exams for adults, adolescents, and pediatrics. They do talk about chain of custody, which of course is really important, but that whole management piece, you know, there's not a lot of guidance about that you need to set up protocols and policies and make sure these things are tight, and that you need to have logs and, you know, maybe set up a good process for releasing of that evidence. So sexual assault evidence management, as you can see, it's a process, right? It encompasses more than that chain of custody. It's the collection, it's preserving it appropriately so that there is a sample that can actually be processed when that specimen makes it to the crime lab. There's what happens to it, you know, how do we get it from the hospital to law enforcement? You know, when do they come and pick that up? Who has responsibility for that? Is it a patrol officer? Is it a crime scene officer? Is it a detective? Who picks that up? Do they understand the significance of that evidence? Property room, maintaining, crime labs, temporary long-term storage. With the enactment of VAWA back in the 1990s, we started looking at non-report cases and who is storing those evidence, those kits. And there are some locations where there are hospitals that have been now forced into storing sexual assault evidence kits until either the survivor says, yes, I think I want to make a police report, and then initiates that, and then the police department, the agency, comes and picks up the kit, or until it gets past that expiration date, and then that evidence or that kit can be destroyed by law. So is that the responsibility of a healthcare facility? No. They do, many times they do not have the facility, the actual facility to be able to hold evidence. There's no policies for this, or there's very, very vague policies. And healthcare should not really be put in that position. We should be storing evidence temporarily until someone can come pick it up. I mean, my goal as a forensic nurse is to collect it and get rid of it as quick as I can and get it to some place where it can be stored. Okay, we talked about temporary storage in hospitals, property rooms, analysis. So what are some of the challenges for sexual assault management? I think I've said a lot, but here are a few more. You know, there's non-law enforcement handling evidence. You know, we are nurses, we're healthcare providers. Our main goal is to provide care to a patient. There's chain of custody, but there's not a lot about evidence management in our foundational sexual assault nurse examiner education courses. And that needs to change. And most forensic programs, a lot of forensic nursing programs do not have nurses on site 24/7. They are on call. And so that can impact the release of sexual assault evidence also, and the associated evidentiary specimens, such as maybe a DFSA kit, a drug facilitated toxicology kit, or clothing. Who has access to that? Sometimes the charge nurse in the emergency department has the key to the evidence locker. Is that appropriate? Who should have that key? Who has management of it? Should security have management or access to the location where evidence is being stored in a hospital waiting to be released? Should security have that? I mean, security thinks in a hospital they need to have a key to everything. They need to be able to get to everything. And my argument is, no, you have no business in my evidence locker, so stay away. You know, there's lack of evidence management standards in healthcare, particularly for in terms of our accreditation for Joint Commission and D&B, and these are the agencies that accredit hospitals. They have standards for providing treatment and care to those who have experienced crime and violence. but there's not a lot of guidance, again, in terms of evidence management, because that is a big piece of what we do when you think about the medical forensic examination. Oops, wrong way. Okay, there's other external factors. There's legislation that's going to impact, when can evidence be disposed. We have crime rates that are going up, particularly now with the pandemic. We hear every day that there's increasing in sexual assault, domestic violence, child abuse. But where are those patients presenting? Are they going to the hospitals? No, because they're afraid to go to the hospital because that's where the sick people are with COVID. And so we have some challenges there in just trying to identify this patient population and get them in so we can collect evidence. We also have the societal attitudes about sexual assault in general, and what people think about someone who has been sexually assaulted, and some of those norms depending on where you are in society, where you live, as to what is your thought process about sexual assault and who can be sexually assaulted, and does that impact. And those norms and values can impact patients coming in and presenting to the hospital to, for evidence collection. And then we have the submitting the kits to the crime lab for analysis. We have to get them out. We have to, why are kits not being submitted? Rebecca Campbell in 2017 and 2018 published a couple of articles examining decision-making and impact on submitting sexual assault kits to a crime lab. And that came out of the Detroit sexual assault kit backlog study. And she looked at that Detroit didn't have the funding or the staffing to test and investigate all sexual assaults. Well, lab capacity is a huge issue as well, and that contributes to some of our backlogs. There's focal concerns, and victim credibility were also influential in explaining why rape kits were not testing. That's something that she found in her study, which was very interesting. And I think we have a ways to go in terms of how we view sexual violence here in the U.S. Sexual assault is on the forefront. It's in the news, right? We hear about the backlogs. We hear about Me Too movement, all of those things. HFSC has really taken great pains to try and eliminate our backlog and to work really, really hard to decrease that, because behind every sexual assault kit, there is a person. And there is a survivor. There is a defendant, or there is an accused, who they have the right to know, what does that kit show? What does the report show? We have wonderful advocates. Our patients and the survivors are advocating for themselves. We have, national coalitions who are advocating for sexual assault evidence and to be tested. We're seeing more and more legislation that's requiring sexual assault evidence be tested and within a certain amount of time. And is kit tracking part of management? We're seeing more and more states that are implementing kit tracking software so that they can follow the kit through the process. Is that management? Is that just a piece of it? I think it's just a piece of it, of the management of it, because again, it starts way back at the beginning, at the time, at the person, with that person. So what are some of the recommendations for improving management for healthcare? I think it's identifying and implementing best practices. It's definitely educating nurses, not only forensic nurses, but registered nurses in the emergency rooms who are taking care of patients, hospital security, anyone who would have come into contact with any type of evidence at all, developing those policies and procedures that are going to be tight. And to really lay it out step by step. What does evidence mean? And then we need to recognize and mitigate liability issues. What happens when I walk away from a sexual assault kit that's open? What does that mean civilly? What could that mean criminally for me as the nurse? What does that mean for the patient that we're seeking? What does that mean for the defendant or the accused? So if I'm leaving evidence around, what are the ripple effect and the downstream effects of that? So there's liability issues that we need to talk about. And not every state has a protocol, a sexual assault protocol to follow. If you look on the SAFE-TA website through the International Association of Forensic Nurses, there is the map here. If you look at the bottom of the screen, and you can click on which your state is and identify and find out, do you have a state protocol? And you'll find that a lot of states do not, which is unfortunate. I want to take a second to talk about what NIST is doing. And NIST has absolutely recognized evidence management, and that it's not just law enforcement in property rooms and crime labs and courts, it's healthcare facilities as well. And they have are looking at guidance on how to manage evidence. And they already have these documents that are available and publicly available that kind of are starting that conversation. We've got the Biological Evidence Preservation Handbook, which is very helpful for us. We've got policy considerations when we're talking to our legislators, and then we've got RFID technology that can help us better manage our property. NIST is also doing some other great things, and I know NIST is on the call, so shout out to Shannon. There's the steering committee for the evidence that's creating evidence management guidelines that's going across and looking at evidence, including hospitals. We're just, and I'm part of that steering committee, and so is Joe Latta. And there will be some guidelines coming out soon that's going to be applicable to everyone, whether you have a small, a medium, or a large facility, which is going to be exciting. They had the management conference in last year, which there's going to be a survey of evidence handlers, so stay tuned for that. There's a community of practice, there's a newsletter. And I put the website there at the bottom of on the slide here for the NIST site, and you can sign up for the newsletter, and it's absolutely free. I think the last newsletter we talked about fentanyl and how to store fentanyl and all of the implications and things that you need to think about. So it's a really good newsletter, and I encourage everyone to sign up for that. And that's it. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you a little bit today. And if you have questions, there's my both of my emails, and I do check them both. So thank you.
Thank you, Stacy. We really appreciate it. You know, it's always amazing to me to see how much of the criminal justice system is impacted by how fragmented we are, the number of different departments and offices and unique situations. And when we see a national organization like NIST or a large urban organization like the Houston Forensic Science Center take a lot of that and begin to standardize it and set improved rules, I think it really makes a difference in the criminal justice system. So we're over time. The final code, CLE code, is ASTROS, A-S-T-R-O-S. And I want to thank all of our presenters, Peter Stout, Jerry Pena, Stacy Mitchell, Akila Mance, and Joe Latta. You guys have really provided a lot of information here. We will post the video on the Quattrone Center website. We'll send it to each of you so you can circulate it to your respective organizations and followers. Thanks very much for taking your time to share this, and be safe and stay well.